Welcome to Lecture 29. You'll recall we're in Chapter 21, and we have already talked about water balance, and we have already talked about electrolyte balance, and this brings us then to the last section of 21, section 21.5, talking about acid-base balance. So to your lecture outline then, and notice now we're starting on page 815 with figure 21.9 up at the top of the page, and we're looking at various sources of hydrogen ions. As we quickly go through these, I'll mention, just to kind of jog your memory, that you are familiar with all of these to some extent, and you don't have to write this additional information down. So for the lecture exam, as long as you're good with these sources of hydrogen ions and what type of acid is being produced by each of these sources, that's all of the detail that I care that you remember for the exam. So first of all then we have, and notice we're starting upper left-hand part of figure 21.9 now, and notice then the top line talks about various processes, and then the arrow coming down from that tells us what particular type of acid is produced by each of these processes. And then notice finally that last long box down at the bottom, each of these processes leading to each of these acids being produced in turn then donates, adds hydrogen ions to our internal environment. And so first of all then, we have the anaerobic respiration of glucose producing carbonic acid. And again, one of those jog your memory types of things that you don't have to write down, but you recall then in A&P 1 when you learned about cellular respiration. This, of course, aerobic respiration of glucose producing carbonic acid is involved in cellular respiration. It's a part of cellular respiration. Number two, then, another source of hydrogen ions. So the anaerobic respiration of glucose producing lactic acid. And again, then you'll recall from A&P1 that when you're exercising aerobically and you get to the point where your blood supply can't keep up with the oxygen demand to break down glucose aerobically, then your body switches over to the anaerobic respiration of glucose, the respiration of glucose without using oxygen, producing lactic acid, and you'll recall then being a much less efficient way to produce energy. Number three, then, another source of hydrogen ions, another source of acids, the incomplete oxidation of fatty acids, producing acidic ketone bodies, which we've talked about in A&P2 from time to time. Number four, then, the oxidation of amino acids containing sulfur, producing sulfuric acid. And number five, then, the breakdown of phosphoproteins and nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, remember, being DNA and RNA, producing phosphoric acid. And the final, think about it but don't write it down thing here for number five now, phosphoric acid, of course, we need a source of phosphorus. And so phosphoproteins, obviously from the name then, are proteins that contain phosphorus or that have phosphate groups attached to them. And you recall then nucleic acids in A&P1 when you talked about DNA and RNA. You'll remember that the building blocks of DNA and RNA are three-part structures called nucleotides, and that one of these three parts of a nucleotide is a phosphate molecule. So again, a source of phosphate. Next on your lecture outline then, talking about the strengths of acids and the strengths of bases. And here you might just jot down what makes something an acid, what makes something a base. And remember then that acids, by definition, add hydrogen ions to solutions. Acids, again, add hydrogen ions to solutions. And in terms of bases, then, you might want to add to your notes here, just as a reminder, that bases, by definition, bases remove hydrogen ions from solutions. Bases, again, remove hydrogen ions from solutions. And so talking now about the strengths of acids and the strengths of bases, and you can add to your notes then, first of all, some acids we refer to as strong acids. And these strong acids add relatively more hydrogen ions. A strong acid, again, will release relatively more hydrogen ions to a solution. And so when we say relatively more hydrogen ions, relative to what? And relative to then weak acids. And so you can add to your notes then that weak acids release relatively or add relatively fewer hydrogen ions. Weak acids, again, add relatively fewer hydrogen ions to a solution. And then talking about the strengths of bases, and so we have, not surprisingly, strong bases, and these strong bases remove relatively more hydrogen ions. Strong bases, again, remove relatively more hydrogen ions from a solution. And then finally, some bases are classified, are referred to as weak bases. And these weak bases then remove relatively fewer hydrogen ions. Weak bases remove relatively fewer hydrogen ions from a solution. Moving on now on your lecture outline and talking about the regulation of hydrogen ion concentration. And first of all, then you'll notice we have these so-called chemical buffer systems. And by definition, then you can see these compounds called buffers help to minimize pH changes in body fluids, so help to prevent large changes in pH in body fluids. And back to your outline, then they do this, these buffers do this, these buffers prevent these large changes in pH in body fluids by converting strong acids into weak acids and by converting strong bases into weak bases. Looking now at the respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide, and notice we're still talking about hydrogen ion concentration here. So you might want to jot down off to the left, we're going to go to page 817. And we're going to look at figure 2110, lower left-hand part of page 817. And this again, as we quickly run through the steps involved here, this again is review for you guys from A&P 1. And let's just see then where hydrogen ion release comes into the picture. So up at the top of the figure then, cells increase production of carbon dioxide, and you should know these steps. So cells again increase their production of carbon dioxide. Think about it then, what causes this increase in the production of carbon dioxide? And the answer, of course, is cells are doing more cellular respiration. And you'll recall, of course, then that carbon dioxide is a byproduct, is a waste product of cellular respiration. So in any case, we have cells increasing production of CO2. Carbon dioxide, again, think back to A&P 1, think back to what you learned about respiratory system, and think back to how carbon dioxide is carried within the bloodstream. And you'll recall then that carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce H2CO3. And here you might just want to jot down as a reminder, H2CO3 is carbonic acid. H2CO3 again is carbonic acid. The third box down then, by definition, since we've produced an acid, this acid will now release hydrogen ions when it goes into solution. So the carbonic acid, the H2CO3, releases hydrogen ions. And then finally, just very quickly, what happens as a result of this increased hydrogen ion concentration in the blood? You want to now get rid of some of these hydrogen ions, these excess hydrogen ions. So the respiratory center is stimulated. The rate of breathing and the depth of breathing increases as a result. When we exhale more carbon dioxide, going back up towards the top part of the figure now, when we exhale, when we get rid of more carbon dioxide, that means we have less CO2 available to react with water. As a result, we produce less carbonic acid, less H2CO3 is produced. And as a result of that, fewer hydrogen ions are released. Let's make that the end of this lecture, and we'll most likely finish off the chapter with the next lecture talking about, just to preview, if you look on your outline, the renal excretion of hydrogen ions, the time course of hydrogen ion regulation, and then we'll talk about acid-base imbalances.